Alright, so let's move on to our second art element, which is the art element of shape. Now, before we get into shape too much, there's a term that I want us to know. Okay, this term is called picture plane. As you can see here, it's at the top of the screen here, and its definition there is underneath it. That basically our picture plane is a plane on which the image resides. It is defined by the edges of the picture. Okay, so if you have like a web browser and you click a window, whatever you can see is going to be limited by the size of that window. And so if an artist is working on a rectangular sheet of paper, then the rectangular border of the paper are the limits of the picture plane. And so if you're using a circular canvas, then it's defined by that circular edge. And so that plane is where the art happens, and so we call it the picture plane. All right, so the first thing I want us to know about shape is something called figure-ground relationship. Okay, it's otherwise known as positive shape and negative shape. The figure means the positive, the ground means the negative shape. And so for this particular example, we're using this one because it's a pretty famous example of this particular dynamic that we call the figure-ground relationship. So for this purposes, let's assume that the artist is working on a white paper. And so if the artist draws the object of a vase there, that would be the figure. That would be the positive shape. And so regardless of what the artist draws, as soon as he draws one shape on the picture plane, he necessarily draws another shape, or she necessarily draws another shape on that picture plane. And so that's why this is such a good example, because when you draw that vase in black, you necessarily make that negative shape of the two faces that look like they were looking at each other in the white. Okay, and so if we started off with a black sheet of paper and in this case drew the two white faces, then those would be the positive shapes, and then the vase there would be the ground or the negative shape. So this one is kind of a confusing thing as far as, is it figure, is it ground, because it's like a checkerboard. Is it a black checkerboard with red squares, or is it a red checkerboard with black squares? This one's kind of playing with that dynamic. But usually in art we see an object, and so the object itself would be the figure, and then the background would be more along the lines of the object. But what this is such a good example is how that relationship happens, that when you draw one, you necessarily draw the other. Okay, let's look at some kind of clever examples of this particular usage in art. We see this a lot in graphic design, actually. And so in the top left section, which is over here, if you first look at it, you probably see a tree, some birds in the air, and what looks like some foliage on the ground there. When you look at the negative space, you can see what looks like a lion looking at a gorilla in the negative shape. You can see the gorilla's face is here, looking this way, and the lion's face looking the opposite way at the gorilla. And so that's a good usage of that positive shape of the tree, and it makes that outline of the animals. On the bottom, we see the FedEx logo, and if you just look at it on the left, you might not notice what you actually see. If you look on the right, zoomed in here, we see a little arrow in between the E and the X that's made with the negative shape, the positive shape being the E and the X. And so it's a clever little example of using an arrow, which is a pretty good kind of basic sign to use for a shipping company, and moving something forward. The final example that we see up here in the top right, that's an example from really a master of this particular dynamic here. His name was M.C. Escher, and a lot of his work deals with that type of interplay between positive and negative space or shapes, like we see in this particular example, how he's using the birds in the top. As you go further down, it creates that shape that we see that emerges with the fish at the bottom. And so those are all along the same lines of playing with this figure ground dynamic or relationship. Most of the time it's more clear than this one, but I thought this one was kind of a clever example too. In this case, he's kind of deliberately hiding the figures in the foreground, which would be the horses, which normally the horses, if they were colored this way, would probably stand out pretty well, but in this case, the artist is kind of intentionally blending them in there with the background, and so it's kind of another example of an artist kind of playing with this particular dynamic as well. Okay, so first thing a shape is that figure ground or positive and negative shape dynamic or relationship. The next thing that we need to know about shape is the two different categories of shape. We have geometric shapes and organic shapes. Our geometric shapes are the regular shapes: triangles, circles, rectangles, squares, hexagons, dodecagons, anything that would be a regular geometric shape, we are going to call a geometric shape. Okay, the other category, if it's not going to be a geometric shape, would be considered an organic shape. These are the irregular shapes. Okay, and they're called organic shapes because they're the shapes that we most often see in nature. If you notice, you look at nature, we don't see a lot of regular shapes. Occasionally we'll see some geometric shapes. You know, for instance, if we look at the moon, it appears like a circle, sphere, and that's geometric. And if we back up from the Earth far enough, we'd see the same thing. But with most things that we see in nature, it's more of these organic shapes. Okay, and so that's why we call them that. And so these are two opposite types of shapes. One very structured, and the other one's you know, a little bit more more irregular in nature. Okay, so if we look at this example in artwork, we can see how a lot of these shapes are geometric in nature. A lot of things man-made are pretty geometric. For instance, if we look in the back, that what looks to be a candle holder is going to be a basic geometric shape. The same thing with the glass that's leaning on its end there in the foreground. Even the book's going to have a basic rectangular shape to it. The organic shapes are the feather that we see, the skull that we see as well. As I mentioned, most of those shapes that we see in nature are going to be more of an organic shape. Okay, and looking at this example, I use this example because it's an example of kind of playing with this geometric versus organic type of nature. This is a painting by Salvador Dali, and a lot of his work's kind of strange, kind of out there, kind of weird looking. And what he's doing here is he's taking things that are normally geometric, like a round clock, and by showing them looking like they're melting, they look more organic. And so we do have some geometric shapes, for instance, the table, the cube there, as well as the oval in the what looks like to be a pocket watch there in the bottom left is an example of geometric shapes. If we look at the tree, the mountains in the background, that type of biomorphic figure there in the mid center of the painting as well, those are all examples of organic shapes. And so one thing that kind of gives the eerie quality with this one is the way he's again taking these geometric shapes and making them look a little bit more organic. Alright, so main things here for shape is picture plane, figure ground, relationship, as well as our two different types of shape, being able to identify geometric shapes and being able to identify organic shapes. Alright, that will be it for this particular video. See you in the next one.